I welcome Vasant. Just I wanted to bring it begin at a very basic level. Alexa seems to be the most popular way everybody is intersecting with AI. So how do you, I mean, you're seeing the big picture from wherever you are.
Yeah.
How do you see people engaging with AI beyond Alexa?
Well, Alexa is actually a fairly recent entrant into the AI business. AI, without us realizing it, has already been creeping into our lives in ways that we don't even realize, right? Google is essentially all about AI, right? It's a question answering system, and that's a very generic kind of AI. Question answering systems. You have a query, what's the best answer, right? So that was actually one of the earlier examples, really large scale commercial examples of AI. And we don't actually see it, but the search engines are getting smarter and smarter, right? So that's been a very generic kind of thing. And Alexa is relatively recent. It's kind of a voice version of the search engine in a sense, although it's more specialized and meant for you to consume more and order more. But AI has been, it's been in our lives. Routing, transportation, finding the best route. All of those are, examples of AI. And more recently, we're seeing it in, question answering systems, interpretation of data, things like medical images, right? That there are things that machines actually do better than humans, especially around, image interpretation and things like that. So these are all areas in which AI has slowly been creeping into our lives, and that's only going to accelerate, as more data becomes available, and that's sort of the grist for the development of AI.
So clearly there's a potential for AI to be scaled in the intersection with daily lives. In a country like India, where you have so many milestones to achieve, whether it's health, all the issues you mentioned, education, health, communication, transport.
Yeah.
So what do you see the role of AI in a country like India?
It's going to be, it's going to make its way into all of those things. Healthcare, education, transportation. Those are environment is actually screaming for improvement, and those are the kinds of areas in which we will and should see more sort of presence of AI and better solutions. Just to kind of step back and, I think we should ask ourselves, what is AI really all about, right? And what's different about it? And it's really, there's two aspects of it. One is that machines do some things better than we do, right? So we might as well just let them do that. But then also machines become more human-like, right? They become better at understanding us, right? So the interface with us gets better, right? So those are the two sort of driving forces behind AI, and that's what will drive it into all of these application areas. Health, wealth, transportation, education, environment, like all of that stuff will be essentially driven by more and more data becoming available in these areas, and machines either becoming better than humans at doing certain things, or helping us do things better, or making us better, at doing what we do.
Just aside, not to distract us from our conversation, flowing from what you just said, that machines will get better and better, and they do things better than what we do.
Yeah.
Is there a reason to be scared of, you see science fiction, we generally have this fear in our heads about machines and robots.
Yeah.
So legit or overblown?
Well, I think, well, in a larger sense, the fears are legitimate, but I also think that this is an area that we don't really understand fully. I think it's a little premature to be making those kinds of predictions. There are two views on this. One is, it's just going to do things better than us and displace us. That's always been the case with technology, right? There's certain things that technology does better than us, and it displaces us, and that's fine, right? If it takes over stuff that's repetitive, that's drudgery, well, that's a good thing, right? It frees us up to do better things. And that's what technology has done in a broader sense, right? Even though there's pain associated with displacement in the short term, right? In the longer term, it's made jobs more meaningful, like it's elevated the skill level, and expectations that you have from human beings. So, it depends on what sort of view you want to take, but and the truth will probably lie somewhere in the middle. But there is concern that it'll lead to polarization, right? That you'll have, people who work with machines and they'll be sort of, over here, and that everyone else who just uses them, will be, down here. It's really too early to say, but I think these are legitimate concerns. But at the same time, some of them seem to be a little bit overblown.
Exaggerated.
I think if you want to be more optimistic about it, you'd say, well, it will free us up to do more meaningful things. It'll upskill us. It'll make it'll make us better at what we do.
So coming back to India, what are the basic steps that India needs to undertake to harness this potential of AI to improve the lives/livelihoods of the people?
So, the good thing is that we are benefiting from decades of basic R&D that was carried out in the West, right? Primarily in North America and Europe. And I say we're benefiting from that because we've seen the emergence of very powerful algorithms for doing all kinds of things, right? There's all this interest now in deep learning that is, if you sort of reduce it to simple terms, it's all about computers interacting directly with the environment, right? So previously, we had to curate the input for the computer so that it could process it. So humans were in the middle between the computer and the environment, right? And now you have a computer that can see, hear, read, right? And so the machine just becomes capable of doing these perception kinds of problems. And we've seen some incredibly powerful algorithms emerge that are making navigation, self-driving cars possible. And these are available for the benefit of all, right? And they've come out of, expensive R&D that was, in fact, carried out initially by the US Department of Defense, right? So the world is actually benefiting from this innovation. And we can take this one step further, right? We can now deploy these algorithms by making sure that we assemble the right data infrastructure to do so, right? And China is a great example of this, right? They're very astute in terms of how they're exploiting AI, right? They're taking all these general purpose algorithms, they're building their data sets. Now their priorities are somewhat probably a little bit different from India's. They don't have, they're concerned with surveillance, control, like that's the kind of state they are. But it's a very astute kind of strategy, right? Because as I've said before, knowledge springs from data and general purpose algorithms. The general purpose algorithms have been developed, they're all there. And data then leads to further improvements, right? There's this sort of virtuous cycle between data leading, more and better data leading to better products, which in turn leads to more data, right? And so there's this sort of cycle that continues. And that's where the opportunity lies for anyone, right? So China is focused on using it for surveillance, for let's say weapons systems, for transportation. We've got to decide what we want to use it for, right? So that's what India should do. What are the pressing priorities for India? I mean, the way I see it, the cities are a mess, right? They're polluted, they're cluttered. Transportation systems are jammed, they don't work like they're supposed to, right? So basic services, like making people's lives better at an everyday sort of basis, should be a big priority. And so, but we need to decide what those are and then sort of assemble the leadership to make it happen, right? Because the obstacles to making this happen are not technological. Well, there are always technological hurdles and the availability of data, but at the end of the day, it's about leadership, vision, and execution, and that's what will make it work.
So one quick follow-up. So all AI or algorithms are not proprietary. There are some which are in public domain, which can be used by countries like India.
Yeah, in fact, most of the interesting ones are in the public domain.
For example?
Well, let's say algorithms for reinforcement learning, right? You've heard of AlphaGo, right? Those kinds of algorithms make their way into the public domain very quickly because researchers are motivated to publish, right? A lot of research is supported by government grants, right? And there's a requirement that the results be shared, right? So science is about sharing, right? And scientists take pride in the development of these algorithms and sharing them, right? So science is colorblind, right? It's nation blind, right? It publishes whatever there is to publish and makes knowledge available freely, right? So so everyone can benefit from that, and sort of use that to turbocharge what they're trying to do. And what I've argued is that the advantage and the benefits lie in data. The algorithms are there. They'll keep, people will keep developing these. And in fact, if you actually make data available to a large research community, you'll see that will spur innovation as well. Right? Very often, I find that students, very bright students, struggle to get data. They've got great ideas, right, but they have a hard time pulling the data together, right? Imagine if, and this is right off the top of my head, but imagine if, data from transportation systems, right, all the buses that ply every day, right? Let's say that data were available to researchers who could then do things with it, right? Maybe they'd come up with insights that would actually lead to massive inefficiencies in transportation, right? People would find what kinds of things cause, traffic bottlenecks, what kinds of things can alleviate them, right? All of that innovation can happen if we assemble the right kinds of data and make it available to researchers. Now, I'm not saying that all data be available because you have to evaluate the risks also with making certain kinds of sensitive data available. But there are lots of data that are in the public domain that can and should be made available to the research community at large. And that will lead to a lot of innovation.
So if you were asked to, you look at the world and you're looking at India too. So if you're asked to do a reality check on India, on the AI, progress of AI, where would you rank India? At the bottom, middle, or nowhere?
Well, it would seem that at the moment, that India has largely ignored AI, right? We've sort of focused more on IT services, outsourcing, having a cost advantage, which is also what China did in manufacturing, right? But now, that game is over, right? That train left the station a long time ago, right? Now it's all about increased value-added kind of activity, right? I mean, I was telling someone that China now produces the largest number of PhDs in, the science and engineering. I'm the director of the PhD program at data science at NYU. The largest number of applicants were from China, right? So the US is now training Chinese students, right, to go out and, make the world a better place, make China a better place. So India's largely ignored it, but it's not too late, for the reason that I was talking about, which is, hey, these algorithms are general purpose, they're generally available, we can benefit from that innovation as long as we get our act together in terms of putting together the right kinds of data infrastructure to spur further research and innovation.
So you say that India can play catch up.
Yes.
It's not too late.
Right.
For that, you're also saying India needs to create a data infrastructure.
That's correct.
Which is very rudimentary at this point of time. So how does India go about creating this data infrastructure? Tap all these utilities, like you said, the transport departments across the country. How does a country like India go about building this from scratch? Because you have to also get a behavioral change.
Well, yes, that's true. But I think it begins with the right leadership, right? There has to be a vision, right? The leadership and vision exists in China, right? They have it, right? And they're executing it, right? So they know exactly where they're going. India doesn't have a roadmap yet, right? You can't get there unless you have a map and a plan, right? So the first thing would be to come up with a plan to identify what kinds of data infrastructures can be built that are a no-brainer, right? The kinds of infrastructures where we need to do a little more thinking, right? So if you want to, let's say, enhance state capacity in terms of law and order, right? Maybe you need better surveillance systems, right? Maybe you need systems that discourage certain kinds of activity. There's nothing wrong with that, right? As long as you're not violating individual liberties, right? It's perfectly fine to have, systems that are watching, are surveilling at a high level without sort of infringing on individuals, right? So those kinds of systems can lead to insights and inefficiencies that exist in all of our systems, like in terms of law and order, governance, transportation, right? But it needs a plan. Right? You need a plan to begin, and at the moment, I don't see a plan, right? I've seen some documents, but I don't see a plan. I don't see a vision. I don't see any sort of signs of execution happening in a sort of concerted way.
You mentioned in passing the concern on privacy. You need to ensure you protect it.
Right.
How does, in India right now, we're in the midst of a serious debate on privacy.
Right.
And the government is in the process of passing a privacy law at some stage. But the worldwide experience on privacy, particularly in surveillance, an issue like surveillance cameras, Britain's productionized this to a degree, extreme degree. New York has it.
Yes.
So how do you see India, how does India address a privacy concern given the global context of this whole debate on privacy?
Well, you mentioned like surveillance cameras, right? I mean, I think that's pretty much a given, right? You need those kinds of sensors, to figure out, what's going on, right? And that doesn't mean you're violating privacy, right? If you're surveilling, it means that if someone engages in a criminal activity, well, they can get caught because they're being watched, right? I don't see anything particularly problematic with that, right? Because the age of innocence is kind of over, right? And I think we're sort of in an era where individuals can wield tremendous destructive power, right? So I don't think it's surprising that states are beginning to use technology to try and thwart that, right? So in a sense, there's no choice, right? If you don't do anything, then you're just going to see the same thing over and over again. But that said, I think that if you start collecting data about people at the individual level and your goal is to recognize who's where at any point in time, well, that's creepy, that's invasive, there's no need for that, right? But I think there is a need for that balance, between, let's say, privacy and security, right? There's got to be some balance that exists there. I mean, I don't think we can get, I don't think we should allow ourselves to get paralyzed by issues of privacy. I think these are important issues, but I don't think they should cause paralysis. I think we need to make some decisions and assess the trade-offs, the risks associated of privacy violation, and have some kind of policies as to what we're willing to accept and what we're not, right?
So like I have a no-go area list.
Yeah, I think those are solvable problems, right? But I think there's also a danger of sort of paralysis where you can say, well, no, that's not possible because it could violate my individual privacy. Well, if the costs to society are large, well, then you're going to have to give up some of those,
So it has to be a fine trade-off between privacy and public good.
Yeah,
so
exactly. And we do that all the time anyway, right? We're always assessing the benefits of something relative to the risks and the costs, right? We're doing that with driverless cars at the moment, right? And at some point, we're going to have to assess, because cars make mistakes, they'll have accidents just like humans do, right? We'll have to sort of make cost-benefit trade-off there. And, privacy is no different, right? At some point, you need to make some trade-offs as to how much is too much.
Right. Vasant, that leads to our next question, that is, do you need to regulate AI? It's an entirely new territory. So do you, as a public policy person, do you believe we should regulate AI? And if so, what are the kind of directions or steps?
The purpose of any kind of regulation is, fairness, stability, creating confidence in a system. So for example, when you talk about regulating AI, the answer is yes, in a very broad sense. You should. Now the question is where, why, how, right? And I'll come back to the issues that are raised. Let's say fairness, right? So there's a concern at the moment, for example, that these AI systems can perpetuate inequality, right? Because let's say you're relying on arrest records of people to build a system that tells you who you should arrest. Well, if the arrest records have a certain bias in that, well, then these systems will perpetuate that bias, right? And you do need some safeguards against that kind of thing, right? And we're beginning to see that conversation happen, in the US and Europe, and we should be having it in India as well, right? So the broad answer to your question is yes. Specifically how that happens, well, the way to assess that would be to what extent are these systems, let's say, going against fairness, right? Are they violating just some principles of fairness, right? Could they cause instability in a system? Could they cause people to exploit a system in a certain way, right? And it's impossible to regulate, everything a priori, right? Because it's hard to see the consequences of these technologies. I mean, even the smartest of us, it's hard to say, well, here's what the policy should be, and it's ground in stone. One has to sort of, see how this thing develops and regulate accordingly, right? I mean, the role of regulation should not be to stifle innovation, but just to protect, against these kinds of things, right? Protect against unfairness, protect against instability, that kind of stuff. So it's something that we can see as we go along, right? And it's no different from regulation in the US, right? I mean, the financial markets are one of the most heavily regulated markets in the US. That regulation has happened over time. And, mishaps happen, regulators say, oh, we should have foreseen that, we didn't, well, let's put something into place that'll prevent that from happening going forward. So to come back to the original question, the answer is yes. But the form it takes will depend on, how it plays out.
My final question to you, one big concern that is expressed everywhere is that introduction of AI, particularly in a country like India, will lead to loss of jobs. Is this hypothesis correct or no? I mean, will AI mean loss of jobs?
Well, it will lead to loss of certain kinds of jobs, but then it'll lead to creation of other kinds of jobs too, right? I mean, if India develops an industry around AI, well, it'll lead to jobs in that industry. It'll lead to jobs around, in that whole ecosystem. So for example, even driverless cars, right? Sure, they might displace drivers, but they'll create a demand for testers, or certain kinds of jobs that don't actually exist right now. It's hard to know what that balance will be between jobs lost and jobs created, right? And people look at history, but of course, this is uncharted territory. But if you look at history, you see that cycles of job displacement and then job creation happening at the same time, because there were things that we hadn't even envisioned that emerge, and I'm sure that the same thing will happen with AI technologies, right? There'll be all kinds of jobs that are impossible to envision at the moment that'll come up. But I don't think that's a cause for alarm anytime in the near future.
Great. Thank you so much, Vasant, for
You're
sharing
welcome.
so much of it with
Sure.
us.
You're welcome.
Thanks.